I'm George Leak. I've lived in Austin since '82. There was a show at the State Theater for Halloween 1985, and it was one of these things where like 10 different bands, some bands I'd seen before, but here was this band called Cargo Cult. It's like, man, what a, it was really interesting group, and this whole thing with this sort of Polynesian stuff, and Biscuit had a couple of songs about Vietnam, and it was a real interesting show. One of the things that show that really stands out is somebody in the middle of the set threw this baggie, and he's like, "Oh my God!" It's just this baggie. He had made this dress out of bologna sandwiches in Ziploc bags, and somebody had like saved one of the bologna sandwiches from the show from like a year ago and like threw it on stage during. But it was just, he would wear these like outlandish costumes, and I think that was something that happened, in the big boys days, but definitely was a big thing about Cargo Cult. And of course it was Halloween and everybody was wearing a little bit of costume. Great songs and everything. So I became a fan of theirs, and I started going to see some of their shows. What I heard was there was this Big Boys show where Biscuit was on stage. He was talking about when he first got back from Vietnam, to Austin. What was happening was the big, Willie Nelson Cosmic Cowboys stuff, right? And so he really got into that scene, sort of like the early '70s. And he told the story at this Big Boys show about actually hanging out with Willie Nelson, and he described in vivid detail this sexual encounter that he had with Willie Nelson, with graphic detail about Willie's junk. I mean, really graphic detail, really punk rock, And I've heard the story from several different people that were at the show, and it was almost I think even a lot of the people in the audience, people were kind of taken aback a little bit. Even some of the members of the band were kind of, but it was also kind of oh God, yeah, it's kind of how punk rock is that? I mean, I could talk a lot more about Cargo Cult. I mean, you'd go to, you see their show. I mean, there just wasn't really a band really quite like that. I mean, there was a band that kind of did. They just such a vivid show, and it was kind of glam, it was kind of camp, but not really, because it was the kind of material that Cargo Cult was doing was just all the stuff about insecurities, and like I said, I mean, they did, he had a couple songs about Vietnam, being in Vietnam is. And I just the stage presence. I don't know. A lot of bands back in the day, that would sort of dress up and be kind of camp and be sort of punk rock, but there wasn't this really serious undertone. And it's kind of one of the things about Cargo Cult. It's so kind of. I mean, I guess to some extent the Butthole Surfers kind of had a bit, but there was always kind of a jokey thing with them. But it was just. I don't know. It just seemed like they really had something to say with what they were doing, and their record was great. And every time you go see a Cargo Cult show, and apparently this was what the case was, with Biscuit, during the Big Boys. I mean, he would have just some elaborate, just new bizarre costume. I mean, the guy, everybody talks about, what were the things that that the Big Boys were about, besides that all these guys that were into, punk rock, and of course skateboarding, but also, I mean, especially those two guys, Tim Kerr and Biscuit, were just they were also artists, and they're just very much sort of the sort of street art ethos. They're both, very, very much so, and just really it came out both in the costumes, but also the album covers. And it was just. I mean, he was almost kind of a force of nature, Biscuit really was,